Good afternoon to some of you, good evening to others. Welcome everyone. My name is James Green and I'm the Francis and Benjamin Benenson Foundation Assistant Curator of African Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. I want to begin just by warmly thanking you all for joining us today, for finding the time to log on from all over the world and from many different time zones. The interest and response this dialogue has generated has been profound, and it really shows that there is an interest in this topic, but also specifically a desire to hear what Raphael and Desiree have to say. We have listeners who have registered from across the African continent, Angola, Botswana, South Africa, and of course, Namibia and Zimbabwe, where our speakers are joining us from. I want to thank the Yale Macmillan Center and the Council on African Studies for their generous support, and at the gallery, the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund. Thank you to our director, Stephanie Wiles, for her encouragement, and all my colleagues at Yale, at the Macmillan Center, Kristen, Nora, at the gallery, Ceci, Maureen, Jake, Liz. Thank you for working so hard to make this happen and for allowing us to make the most out of this digital format, which, as we all know, isn't necessarily always the easiest. We have live closed captioning technology. Please just click the button at the bottom of your Zoom window and just let us know if you have any technical issues in the chat. Without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers today. Raphael Chikukwa, who is joining us from Harare in Zimbabwe, and Desiree Nanuses, who is joining us from Windhoek in Namibia. Raphael was recently appointed Executive Director of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, and I want to offer my warm congratulations to you, Raphael.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much.
Raphael began in 2010 as Chief Curator of Contemporary Art, and over the last decade, Raphael has been a true force in the African art world. He's overseen a groundbreaking program of exhibitions in Harare, supporting local talent, while also developing the gallery's international outreach. He was the founding curator of the Zimbabwe Pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennale in 2011, and he has been the curator of the Zimbabwe Pavilion at Venice since that time. There is no doubt that his scholarship, his dedication to cultural heritage, and his strength of personality continues to have an impact on the contemporary arts of Zimbabwe. Welcome, Raphael, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, James, for giving us this opportunity to be able to dialogue.
So our next speaker is Desiree Nanuses, who is the Acting Chief Curator and Collections Curator for the National Art Gallery of Namibia, and she serves on the Namibian Heritage Council. Desiree is currently enrolled in the Curatorial Practice PhD program at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and she has completed her MA at Kingston University in London. Desiree is the bright future of African museums, and in her own research, she focuses on the importance of oral history as it relates to healing and self-actualization. I'm sure that many of our listeners will have questions for you both. We will have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end, so please make sure to submit questions using the Q&A button. Thank you, Desiree.
Thank you, James.
So even though we are meeting each other here in this digital realm, scattered in the ether, as it were, I thought that we could just try and situate ourselves physically in the world. So I'm speaking to you from New Haven, and I'm pleased to say that the gallery is open to the public again, and I'm in my office, as you can see. We have opened at a reduced capacity over the weekend, and this started on Friday, September 25th, when we opened after a 6-month closure, welcoming back our visitors to our 3 special exhibitions. And I've put them on this slide here on the right. And the enthusiastic response we've had to the reopening really serves as a reminder of how important it is to get to the museum and to have that moment of close engagement with a work of art IRL, in real life. So Raphael, could you tell us what is on view at the National Gallery in Harare right now?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much, listeners who are listening from around the world. What is currently showing at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, it's an exhibition by a Cuban artist, David Palacios. It's entitled Point of View. This exhibition was supposed to open in March, so it has been in quarantine since March up to the present day. And the other exhibition is called Aftershock, Reimagining Life After Cyclone Idai, which is commemorating 1 year after the Cyclone Idai that hit both Chimanimani and Chipinge, which was a natural disaster, the biggest disaster ever in the country. So the images are there to tell the story of those who were affected by Cyclone Idai. Thank you.
So it's clear that the museum is both a space for art history in its traditional sense, a monographic exhibition, and as a place for record, for memory, for setting down the events surrounding this traumatic recent event. Are there any upcoming exhibitions or events that you would like your listeners to be aware of?
Well, basically the upcoming exhibition after we have taken down the 2 exhibitions would be the exhibition which we showcased at the Venice Biennale in 2017 and 2019. We are going to showcase them to the Zimbabwean audience because our Venice Biennale project is not only for the international audience in Venice, but also for the local audience in Zimbabwe.
Wonderful. So there's this interplay between the local and the international.
Exactly.
And so Desiree, if we turn to you now. So the Namibian government has ended its 6-month state of emergency and has since begun to relax travel restrictions and people can go to work, etc. Have things changed dramatically at the gallery since then?
Actually, we were closed only for about the first month of the state of emergency. We were open since May, but since we opened up in April, what's been really amazing is that our collections were already being digitized, I think since 2017, and that gave us like an opportunity, even the moment that we were in lockdown, to put all our exhibitions online, which has been very, very useful for us. So now it's making sure that people get used to accessing the exhibitions online, because it's not something that everybody has been accustomed to wanting to do. And you know, that whole sacred experience of going to an exhibition and experiencing stuff in the space. So I do feel it removes that experience a bit, but now currently what we do have is a exhibition titled Landscapes. And Landscapes is very interesting and exciting. Just last week we had the landscape dialogues, because landscapes, we wanted to look at my practice. Let me explain this. My practice very much is making sure it's an autoethnographic practice, which originates from a conversation I had with my dad, where he said to me, when he told me, no, it's high school, you're gonna go to the German school. And I said to my dad, no, I don't wanna go to the German school, why, you know? And he just said one of those, no, Desiree, you're gonna go to the German school. You're gonna learn everything they know, and there's nothing gonna be different from you except the color of your skin. And my research is titled The Politics of My Skin because of this, because it stems from that conversation with my dad. And it's an autoethnographic practice because you are looking at decolonizing the practice itself. And I think when one associates that now with the exhibition that we put up, it's making sure that you are looking at the landscape, but what does this landscape mean to you? You look at the different objects. I mean, like, for example, the slide that you see on the screen now, you have the dogs in the front of the houses. The houses are literally, the installation of the houses in the back is titled Kwengehayi, which means people were there, you know? And this is a work by Shia Karusab from 2001. However, the image that you see right in the back is also ghettos, which shows you this is landscape as home, and it's 2013, and it's Franz Nambinga, but then what you can tell is that not much has changed in this 10-year period. So the exhibition is making sure to look at those disparities that exist. What is it, especially in the time of COVID that we'd entered, how can we as an institution advocate with this exhibition for our visual artists and their livelihoods? And the dialogue that we had had last week was to introduce landscape as activism, which is us wanting to advocate for how they can acquire, how they can have access to housing. I mean, they don't have a paycheck, number one. Number two, what about things like medical aid? You know, now it's a pandemic, people are getting sick. So how are you going to help visual artists to be able to help themselves sustain themselves in this time? I mean, something simple like having the dogs in the front of the house, for example, is very easy. We would look at dogs when you're going into the locations. It's part of the community. You can enter anybody's yard. Dog is on the pavement. Nobody is going to be attacked by the dog. However, if you go to the other side of town, you barely see the dog. It's all high walls, you know, and this is our cityscape that we are dealing with. And then all of a sudden you have these inequalities and disparities that exist, because you're going to see the sign, beware of dog. You're going to hear the dog. You may not necessarily see him. You may not even have access to that house. So landscapes looks at landscape as the space, which is the open, vast areas, how the colonizing brought in borders, all of that, but then it also looks at landscape as witnessing, you know. Namibia is listed currently #1 in road rage. And I think that for us is a very important thing to take to mind, because you don't want to just say, we're doing an exhibition and the exhibition is, oh, it's for aesthetic value. No, I don't think Africans have ever created anything for the purpose of it being just for aesthetic value. It's very much with purpose and intent. And that's why we are using, obviously, the artworks, this point of engagement, to ensure that we are communicating what the artists are saying, what their situations are, how we can address and how we can increase and add value to them as visual artists. So yes, that has been what's been happening so far. But I think also what I would want to then just bring is when there was one particular conversation that I had with a colleague of mine. And I mean, she's Western and I am not. And we stood in front of this panoramic view landscape. And it's by Christian Golds. And I stood there and she says, oh no, this is beautiful. And I, you know, Elisa, I love you. She says, oh, this is beautiful. And then I said, oh, that's what you see. You see a beautiful landscape. You know, this crate is beautiful to you. For me, that is lived land. And it's because my practice forces me to ask questions, and it has been an intentional interrogation of my history. So I have to go back and ask my parents, my grandparents, what about us? Where have we come from? What does this mean? Because you want to edify and understand your history and make sure that it is understood in a proper way, so that people are able to not only look at it from the information that has been shared with us by somebody else's writing or a colonizer's writing, but that it needs to be my own writing, and how we address these canonical literature and insert the Namibian or the African perspective into these. That is, you know, it's to make sure that you decolonize the practice, but also the works, the collections. So this panoramic view, I gave you the picture of Paul Kiddo.
Yeah,
because
so we've got it here at the bottom here for our listeners. Yeah.
So I gave you the picture also of Paul Kiddo, which is the top one. And then Paul Kiddo's perspective, obviously, he's from the South. The crater, the Rotterdam crater is also documented in the South. But Paul Kiddo documents landscape as in with people. What is it that is visible there? And it's part of they're both in this landscape exhibition, but they are contradictory voices, if I could put it like that, because the landscape by Golds, obviously, it tells you that this is what I want. It's that whole editing. If somebody's in the picture, can you please move? It's not just that reality that is documented. However, with Paul Kiddo, I mean, it's two works that are standing side by side. One is coming, and you can see that from the donkey cart, and the other one is going, you know, and for me, it's his way. I mean, Paul Kiddo is very important to us because now he's even ill. He can't even paint anymore, but his way of documenting Namibian landscapes. Now, the recent work we had in a recent exhibition is even not only homesteads, but very much like the transport system, the taxi ranks, you know, the Christuskirche we have in Centertown. He documents these iconic spaces, and for that, landscapes, he's an important artist to be reckoned with. So, yeah. Sorry, went on there for a bit.
Fascinating, and it does. You are pushing against this apartheid era art history that presents these empty landscapes. You're putting the people back into the landscape.
I think it's for me, the question is, how do you intentionally edit out, or how do you, if you look at the Rotakam, for example, the panoramic view, that is probably how Namibia was sold. That is probably how Africa was sold right in the beginning, because now you've told these people stories about, no, it's vast open spaces, but what we don't realize, and I think this is very important and key, what we don't realize is that when people were living in Africa, before anybody else from outside came, people were living in a civilized manner. So your sun was your clock. You knew this is the time for this is the time for that. Your seasons were how you moved around, how you navigated your landscape. So there's indigenous knowledge that is inherently within the people of the country that already existed, that they had all this knowledge and they knew how to exist within each other. I mean, one of the stories my dad would say is like, for example, if his family came to an area where maybe there was an Bushman clan, literally. So if there was already Heru people in the area, you see each other, it's unspoken, it's a law that exists, but you don't go into the other person's space, you don't hunt my animals, So these types of things it was unspoken laws, but they existed. And to make sure that these, what we do, what needs to be done, I believe, is to make sure that you connect that intangible heritage to the objects, so that objects carry that significance, so that they carry that value, so that people appreciate the objects for what they are, especially in talks of restitution and repatriation, because objects is what we look at. I mean, one writer, what is his name? He says it so well, where he says, we look through objects to see not only what they present, but we look through them to see something about society, about us, but mostly they reflect who we are, And I think when one looks at objects in that way, they add value to you, and those valuable, the indigenous knowledge that resides within these objects is key for discussions like these. So when I look at landscapes, and I don't appreciate the idea of editing things out, or even the perspectives, how they are presented, because now literature, if my daughter has to go to the university now, I honestly don't want her to be taught only Western ways of making. I need her to be taught new Namibian ways of making. And I mean, my master's study focused very much, it was titled Laslapian, which means patchwork. And it was this weaving tool that I used to connect the intangible knowledge to art, architecture, and design objects, and what they mean for the Khoisan, So I think that type of a weaving tool is the practice where you want to make sure that you are teaching what you know, and that it's a generationally passed down, so that it doesn't die out. Like, one of the things that is very important for me from the previous conversation that I had with Raphael was, we spoke about printmaking, and how there's an exhibition that I am proposing currently for our gallery, which is Mr. Medicia's works, and not Mr. Medicia, no, John Mafangeo's works, and John Mafangeo, who taught Mr. Medicia, and now Mr. Medicia, who taught Papa Shikongeni and Alphys Mvula, and then how they now taught the younger ones, and to have this coherent representation as part of an exhibition, because then my daughter wouldn't look at Mr. Mafangeo's work and say, oh no, it's cultural homesteads, it's outdated, but they'd be able to see works by Amutenyu, for example, Petrus Amutenyu, who's a young printmaker now, very much alive, vibrant, exciting, edgy stuff, but she would be able to relate to that, because it's more color, it's not just black and white anymore, So it's that whole idea of making sure that we present a coherent view instead of just partial, or instead of a limited narrative, and I think that is what I'm investigating.
And that these bodies of knowledge are passed down over the generations.
Absolutely. That is important, because you want to make sure that this knowledge, so an exhibition we are preparing for now is called What's Your Story? And we're going to be documenting artists in their makers' processes. And obviously this will add value to curriculum development. And so that this can now be taught in the universities, for example, that this knowledge can be taught into that it becomes what we have written about. Artists have created this. I mean, Mr. Medici is part of this process. We want them to tell how they make, what they've created, so that this is what needs to be taught down generationally, so that it doesn't die out, because we're going to lose our culture if we don't enforce that, we don't forget where we've come from, because that determines where you're going to go.
So I think that leads us nicely onto the main topic of our conversation today, which really is thinking about restitution and repatriation from an African perspective. And when we've discussed this, we wanted to begin this conversation with just a discussion of this this really pivotal watershed moment in 2015 when the statue of Cecil John Rhodes was removed from the University of Cape Town, and the South African artist Thembile Mesinani chose this site and this moment to create a performance where she embodied Chipungu, a carved soapstone bird that is actually still in the Cecil John Rhodes Grootsure estate collection. And Raphael, I just wanted you to pick up from this point. I know you know this artist well, and that this is very relevant to your collection.
Well, I mean, thank you very much, James. And talking about Thembile Msezane, a South African young artist who has really taken the world by storm in 2015, when there were demonstrations about the Rhodes must fall. And at that moment, her performance really managed to, actually what we discussed earlier on, it was kind of a watershed of what is actually transpiring today. And looking at the Zimbabwe bird, which is Chipungu, which was, these were part and parcel of the objects, our cultural objects that were actually looted during the cultural genocide around the 18th century and way back. And that same bird is still sitting in South Africa, in Cape Town. But it is very, very important for us to understand that when we also grew up, we were told that Great Zimbabwe was not built by Zimbabweans, was not built by Black people. So that's the need for us to be able to rewrite that history, and the need for us to be able to tell our story from our own perspective. But one of the most important things which we need to think about is also the artists like Thembile Msezane, what role they play in order for them to, I would say, to be torch bearers to the current discussions that we are talking about, restitution and repatriation. Because the fall of Cecil John Rhodes statue, or the Rhodes must fall, in 2015 was a sign of our people really telling the story the way we want it to be told, and the falling of some of the colonial monuments, which today we've seen in America, in Belgium, in the United Kingdom. But it is very, very important for us to revisit how these objects found themselves in what they call the so-called museums in the Western world. So it is very, very important, and to be able to connect these objects to where they come from, and to be able to bring them back to where they belong, so much that they can carry the right context. Because today they've become kind of diasporic objects instead of them being back home in Africa in their own context, and for their own people to be able to appreciate, and for us to be able to rewrite that history, because most of them, they carry names which do not exist in our own languages and in our own countries.
Mm. And I just want to say we've put a link to Susanne's TED Talk in the chat, and if you have a moment to watch it, it's very powerful. And it just, I think that when we look back at this moment from 2015, given what, as you said, Raphael, given what's happened in the last 5 years, it's clear that there is a strong correlation between this desire for the fall of racist statues and for the repatriation of looted objects. And there's Professor Dan Hicks at the University of Oxford has been doing some work on this around the Pitt Rivers collection, which is worth looking into. So, Raphael, we discussed how, you know, the idea of and Felwyn Sauer talks about this, the idea of the re-socialization of these objects, how as they have traveled after being stolen, they've had these lives outside of the context for which they were produced. Can you tell us something about what happens to these objects when they return? Because they'll still bear these histories that have been put on them. how can you imagine their new futures in Africa?
Thank you very much. One thing which we need to understand here is some of the objects, they were ceremonial objects. Some of the objects were utility objects. Some of the objects, they were coming from kind of spiritual objects that the way we want to see them in the continent is some of them to be able, for the communities to be able to reconnect with them.
Yes.
And remember, we're not only talking about objects here, we are also talking about archives, we are talking about human remains, and talking
Yes.
about so many things that were looted during that cultural genocide. So a good example is the Mukwati walking stick that was repatriated back into the National Museum and Monuments or into Zimbabwe. The Mukwati family, whenever they want to do their ceremonies, they'll come and take because they own the stick. For the museum, we are just the custodian. We are just we're just keepers of the object. So there is a way which African cultural institutions needs to come together with communities where these objects come from. So much that there is a meeting point between where the objects come from and the museum and the role and function of those objects in their communities. Because some of them, they were rain-making walking sticks or rain-making objects that the rain-making ceremonies needs to continue because some of the taboos which were carried out by our ancestors are no longer there. We have come to forget the taboos, but we also come to forget the taboos because of the colonial legacy. Remember, colonization came with its own baggage, and that baggage, it included making sure that you are removed from who you are. And when they started, I remember if you, a book by Mozo Chikukwa, a professor who is in America, a Zimbabwean, talking about how education and the missionaries were actually part and parcel of the looters of the objects into the Western world. But they removed the people from their own objects, which they used to call pagan. And today, those same objects are being appreciated and they're being monetized in the Western world within the museums. And yet the African people, they're still swimming in poverty. And yet their objects are the ones which, through cultural tourism in the so-called museums, and yet their houses of stolen goods. So there's a need for us to remind ourselves that when these objects, we are talking about them coming back into the continent, we need to work on the preparedness of these objects. And also to look at how an inventory has to be carried out to where these objects are, be it in Paris, in London, in New York, in Berlin, or in Brussels. There's a need for us to be able to carry out these inventories and to get to understand. And we know very well that there is a tendency, a colonial tendency of saying the objects might not be able to be looked after. So there's a need for us to look into that.
Mm. So I've shared this slide relating to the Makonde masks that you wanted to make listeners aware of. Can you tell us more about this collection of objects?
The collection of objects you are looking at two Makonde masks. The Makonde mask originally from Tanzania, and we have part of the Makonde mask as a permanent collection in the National Gallery. Then you've got those 4 headrests, which are the Zulu headrests. Some, they want to call them Shona. There's no such thing as Shona, because it's either you're Karanga, you're Abuja, you're Korekore, or you are any other tribe. But these objects were stolen at the National Gallery in 2004. And it was during the economic situation when things were really down. But at the end of the day, it was reported that they were stolen from the National Gallery, but they carry a sign. So through Interpol, these objects were able to discovered when they were supposed to be auctioned out there in the Western world. And the person was arrested and was jailed. Then they were repatriated. They were taken back into our Zimbabwean embassy in Germany. And later on, we had a colleague who was in Germany. They had to repatriate them back into Zimbabwe. So why I'm telling this story is also the idea of how prepared are we in terms of making sure that these objects, when they are returned back into cultural institutions in Africa, they are safe. Because sometimes when there's political instability, economic instability in countries, cultural objects, they become a target. And we need to prepare ourselves as cultural workers, as cultural institutions, as countries in the continent, so much that these objects do not find themselves back into the so-called museums in the Western world. So there's a need for us from human security with technology, and the museum markings are very, very key. And the lady who is in dreadlocks, she's our former director, Mrs. Sibanda. The other lady, Lillian Chawonwa, who is responsible for the collection and conservation of our objects. So she played a very important role in making sure that Tom Kremers, who is a very specialist in the cultural heritage objects, how they move from one border to another. He also played a part in making sure that we get reunited with these important cultural objects back into the National Gallery. And I'm really glad it happened when I was at the National Gallery. I joined the National Gallery for us to be able to repatriate them back, for us to be reunited with these objects.
Well, what's fascinating is you mentioned that these are from Tanzania originally, but there are also Makonde peoples in Mozambique, and you also described how Shona is a colonial imposition and an invention. And I was wondering if you could touch more on this idea of national borders as being not reflective of the actual region of Southern Africa and where objects come from historically.
We need to understand, and the audience and the listeners need to understand, that the borders were not there during our ancestors' time. Colonization brought in these borders. When you are in Zimbabwe, when you're in Mozambique, when you're in South Africa, when you're in Zambia, and many other neighboring countries, we share, because you've got one family which is, I want to give you an example of the Tonga people. The Tonga people who were separated by the Zambezi. But you have got, when Kariba Dam was constructed, the other group were taken on the other side of the border. The other group were taken on the other side. So today, when those same people want to do ceremonies, they have to join hands because they are from the same family. Same with the Tswanas. You've got the Tswanas of Mozambique, the Tswanas of Zimbabwe, the Tswanas of South Africa, the Tswanas of Namibia. So the borders are a colonial construct. Remember, the Berlin Conference is something which we need to revisit and look at and see how they divided the continent and how they said they actually, Africa was like a cake where the Germans would take this part, the French would take that part, and the British would take that part. And so that on its own is something which is also, which we need to revisit. We need to continuously remind our people that Africa is one.
Yes.
As a continent.
And that's why you wanted to emphasize that this is a discussion from an African perspective.
Exactly. Because we want to speak with one voice, and the Organization of African Union, which is now the AU, is very, very important to us because I'm sure we need to continue deliberating and to make sure that our political actors understand that Africa is one, and when it comes to repatriation and restitution, we must be able to speak with one voice from our own perspective, instead of us being passengers in our own ship.
And actually, to stick with the ship metaphor, Gus Casey Hayford, the previous director at the National Museum for African Art at the Smithsonian, described how all boats must rise together, all institutions, private and public, must work together going forward. So I think this all leads into Desiree, into your work in Namibia, and you wanted to share this image, and this very powerful image, and I was wondering if you could tell us all a little bit more about it.
Yeah, maybe I just want to say something about what Raphael was also talking about now, about the readiness of African museums and the whole taking hands together and making sure that we kind of have a united front and as an African continent, as opposed to a Namibian or a Zimbabwean or a Botswana, you know, that type of approach. One thing that completely stands out for me in Namibia is that our funding body, basically, for studies, etc., for visual arts, they've made it priority so that funding goes to curatorship. And I think if you start looking from governmental level, where are you placing emphasis? Because we have had in the 2-3 years ago, human remains that will return to Namibia. And I think this is probably where this image now starts to flow in. But I wanted to say, just add that with the preparedness, we need to get ready from that perspective, from governmental perspective, so that to make sure that it becomes priority for them key, that if this happens when the French president decides to send back all the works to Africa, that each institution is ready, that their human capacity has been developed so that it's able to maintain, to keep the works, to care for the works, because the excuse is currently that Africa will not be able to take care of it and that we're gonna get that on 99-year loans. And obviously that is not what we want. I mean, if it was mine, you took it illegally, number one, then just return it back, you know? But yeah, let's move on to this image. So I shared this because this is Nicola Brandt, and currently this photograph is taken in Otjozondjupa region, is near where Hendrik Witbooi and his army were ambushed and killed. And just a bit of a historiography, perhaps, to just give contextualization to the genocide, because there's a lot of people that feel it's history, leave it in the past and move on. And I don't think we can do that. We have to go back to address it from ourselves. We need to address it ourselves, so that is the way we move forward, because you cannot move forward unless you've had healing. You cannot move forward unless things have been addressed properly. And also recently in the news, we have had that our president, when he was offered, or when Germany for this genocide offered monetary value, he declined it, because I don't think you can just pay and say, let's just move on, because I think that is just not right. You don't just do that, because then, because you've paid, you think now you can still carry on the way you want to. And Germany had taken so long already to acknowledge that, you know, that it was a genocide that happened. So the 1904 to the 1908 genocide of Namibia had profound political implications, in that it was through defining societies as non-historical, number one, and that colonial forces justified their presence in Namibia, and thus presented themselves as bearers of civilization by preaching good governance, Western literature and philosophy and Christianity and market economy. And I think all of this, we know that this is how the colonizer came to be in our countries. But it is estimated that 50% of the Nama people and 80% of the Ovaherero people were killed. General von Trotta's extermination order for the Ovaherero people, issued on 2nd of October 1904, read that the great general of the German troops, sent this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. The Herero people must now leave the land. If it refuses, I will force them with the Groot Roer, the cannon. Any Herero found inside the German frontier with or without a gun or cattle will be executed, and I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. And these are my words to the Herero people. And I think right 6 months thereafter, he gave the extermination order for the Nama people on April 22nd, 1905, that the Nama who chooses not to surrender and lets himself be seen in German area will be shot until all are exterminated. Those who at the start of the rebellion committed murder against any German peoples have commanded themselves what to be murdered, by law forfeited their lives. It's powerful words that he stated. As for the few not defeated, it will fare with them as it fared with the Herero, who in their blindness also believed that they could make successful war against the powerful German Kaiser and the great German people. I ask you, where are the Herero today? And I think the first genocide of the 20th century may arguably be be the most considered to be publicized by the perpetrators themselves. And this is because they've taken pictures of how they had asked the hetero ladies, like for example, if they decapitated their heads, they'd ask them to, with a blade with their hands, to basically remove the flesh and the skin from the skulls, and then these skulls were kind of just thrown into these crates. And it's this practice of dehumanization of a person, and that the wounds that that type of doing could inflict on anybody, and that you don't want to acknowledge that you have put people through this trauma. I think that for me is where the problem lies. And so this photograph, coming back to this photograph, obviously tells me that the history, the work is titled No Monument for the Fallen, which obviously means that the insertion of the lady in the space, the hetero lady, is in the area where this genocide basically started off. And this is where there's so many unmarked graves, which is obviously what the exhibition also deals with, the landscapes, that there's so many unmarked graves. They've been identified, development wants to take place, people want to start building railroads, but then the progress gets halted because now every time you find bones, people, these concentration camps areas, I mean, where you kept people in these holes in the ground, you didn't feed them, and then later on from starvation, you just, bury them. And I think this type of practice is where we still wonder in our Namibia, well, we've identified the spaces, how about we demarcate the spaces? How about we make for an allocation? How about a monument? How about, when one looks, for example, at what even happened with Austria, the Klimt work, the lady in gold, the Adele work, like for example, when the Nazis went into the apartment and took the work for themselves, although they were Jewish people, and then this work ends up in the museum, it's one of those where you have decided to just take something from me, you've put it here, but there's this I must fight you for what is rightfully mine. And I think that is where, for me, my thinking very much becomes that you need to look at what is the space, which is what this picture for me depicts. You look at the space. How are you going to create a monument for this? And just speaking about this history of the genocide for our What's Your Story exhibition, there were 3 men who have expressed interest to participate in this exhibition, and they have this marble stone, white marble stone, that they would want to carve. And they didn't realize when we sat in the meeting that they actually represented the genocidal lineage, which was there's one German and one Herero and one Nama man, and that these 3 men want to work on carve this stone together. And obviously for me, I see this as a monument because they have no set design. It's basically how things are moving now, where one doesn't know where what is going. Everything is in uncertainty because you are hoping that somehow something figures itself out. And I think that's why having these types of dialogues is so important, so that we can get to a place where we know, okay, we've spoken about this, we've addressed this, we've touched on that, and we've touched on that. How further do we investigate this, so that everybody kind of can get on board, so that once this work, for example, whatever it becomes, it's a unified new representation, new identity that can be set up as a monument. And now the insertion of the lady in the space for me is powerful because I reflect very much on Titus Kafar and Denise Murrell's practices, decolonial practices, which is that idea of you make sure, if I can put it like that, you make sure that you find the presence, because there's been a lot of erasure of who we are as African peoples, from how narratives were constructed, documentation, photographs were taken, that exclusion, that editing out of that there was a Black person in that space, and that with this photograph, Nicola is basically reinserting this person into that space to say, my people are here, and that it's that witnessing, that people were from this area, people are here. I think that for me is very profound, because there is no way, if you look at canonical literature, it is important that we insert these voices now into that literature, so that that literature doesn't exist by itself and we have a new literature, but that it needs to be, you look at it and you have to add those missing, which is obviously what Denise Murrell did with her, sorry.
No. I just think that this is a topic that Raphael is addressing too in Zimbabwe. And Raphael, do you want to talk about this monument?
Well, basically, it's there's a need for us to undo the long and toxic colonial past. But how do we do this? Zimbabwe is only also realizing the importance of remembering those fallen heroes. The ladies you are and who are standing there, and men, these are a symbol of Mbuyane Handa, who was the first Chimurenga hero, a lady who fought the British colonial masters and was murdered and executed by the British after captured in Mashonaland, which is this part of Zimbabwe in Harare, and was taken to Bulawayo and then later on executed. So the Zimbabwean government has now come to realize the importance of actually remembering people like her, and they're creating a monument, Kona Samora Machel and Julius Nyerere in Harare, which is going to be unveiled anytime next year. So it is very, very important as we take down the old monuments and we give birth to the monuments that speak to us, the monument of those that sacrificed their life for us to be liberated. And I would like to stress that the liberation struggle for independence in Africa was not only about political independence, was not only about economic independence, it was also about cultural independence. Yeah. Today, African people, African cultural institutions cannot breathe. Why we cannot breathe is because today we feel we want the cultural air, we want our objects back, because cultural independence is about reclaiming what was stolen from us. So this monument, it is important because Mbuyane Handa, to commemorate her, you are commemorating those who really were brave enough to be able to say no to colonization. But like what Desiree was talking about, the genocide that was carried out by General Van Tota, who actually come from Bremen, where I did an exhibition in Bremen, which was about mobility and migration. But I mean, it's a history that we need to revisit. And I'm sure this is also a moment where we need to reflect on the on blindness to other people's cultures and blindness to cultural rights of other people, which is the Africans, whose cultural rights are also human rights, and they need to be respected. But you can only respect them by doing the right thing. The repatriation and restitution, it's the right thing, especially for the West, to heal the colonial wounds that we're still suffering from. And it can be seen by what I'm talking about in terms of long and toxic history. Yeah. And that long and toxic history is something which we, I think, collaboratively, both cultural institutions in Africa and in the West, we can do this together, and those who are willing to be able to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And Desiree, just to connect to something that you were saying, it's just very clear that restitution is more than a one-off event. And I think it's so crucial that Namibia rejected the apology of Germany recently. It's an ongoing process.
I think it has to be ongoing. And when one thing's, I use myself as an example. When my parents went through the liberation struggle, they lived through it. I mean, I was born in the time when they were fighting that, my mom running away with me in her belly, you know. So when I was born into it, I was born into that mind that I couldn't have this. You have opportunity for this. And it is now, because of what they went through, this is what is imposed on me as a child. And I am in conflict with myself, because I ask myself, if I hadn't gone to that German school, would I then have chosen curatorship as a profession? Is the questions that I'm asking myself, which is why it led me to the studies. Would I then have done this that I'm doing now? And unless we fix this, I'm going to pass these thinkings on to my daughter. And that is what you don't want. Because now you have a generational passing down of negativeness, of hurt, of blaming. Whereas now I can take a moment, look at where it is it's hurting me, how it has affected me, and come to terms with that myself so that moving forward, I know it is my decision. No, I don't want to do this. I'm going to move from here. And I think unless each and every country, each and every object is seen in that way, you bring it back, you start looking at the object for what it is. What does this mean? Is when Raphael said, when that object comes back into your area, there's practices, cultural practices need to be done. I mean, when we received back the human skulls, and when they were handed over, and Hendrik Witwer's Bible and the whip, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, you would want to have that in a museum, but there's a lineage of people who have missed out on their person that died away, and you want to receive this back. I think it is only fair that once a skull, if my lineage skull has come back, I would want to have that opportunity. That's why there's a lot of engagement with our local traditional authorities, traditional leaders, for them to be a part of these discussions that ensure that once the object comes back, the traditional authority becomes a part of this discussion. Are we going to have it? What are we going to do with it? Do you want to have a hero's funeral? Then are we going to go bury them? Because I think it would just be wrong for a local or us as the gallery to say, no, we want to keep the whip here because well, it adds value to our collection. I don't think that's right. It would be better for you to then take it on loan from the original owner. And I think those are the types of things that need to be considered, that need to be discussed. And it's an ongoing discussion, because unless you fix that healing, that history of that lineage that exists there is going to be broken, and they're going to keep passing down this brokenness. So you have to bring back so that there's a reckoning with yourself, so that you can have that, okay, fine, this is what they've done. Fine, we've buried. There's got to be traditional practice. Most of our burials are ritualistic practices where you are putting the person to rest, and there's ceremonies performed around this. And until that also happens, there's a lot that comes around that puts disruption in life that you are not necessarily ready for, because you are sitting with an object in a space. There was a link I once read about the British Museum, who actually, like, the locks would open, the doors would open, you know, and that you wonder, is it not because of what you are keeping in the space that this is happening to you, and that this has happened to your space, and now your guards are scared of working there? You know, it's all of that. So I wouldn't want our institutions to do the same, keeping remains, human remains, for example, or objects that have come back in a institution, unless the people have said, safe, keep it for me.
And this connects to a question we've had from a listener, Dr. Robert Galloway, who wanted you to touch on what healing means. And I think you've addressed that beautifully. Raphael, what does healing mean to you in this sense?
I'm sure healing means a lot. If you have wronged somebody, you need to say sorry. And that process, that statement of saying sorry, will actually heal somebody. In healing, here we are talking about, these are appropriate steps, which I think, when I look at the West, needs to do the right thing. And this will heal colonial wounds, which we still have. But it can be in so many ways, but healing, it's a process that we all need. It's a process that will get us to really come to terms with each other and understand each other better, and also shake hands at some point.
It's this acknowledgement that, you know, I've wronged you. Even just acknowledging that I've been wrong here. That's where I say I've messed up here. You know, and that's why I'm asking for your forgiveness. But in acknowledging that, you are making the other person feel that you are validating what they are feeling to be true, and that you are acknowledging that what you have done to them has actually hurt them. And I think if you just buy me flowers and expect me to move on, that's where the mistake is. You cannot buy flowers and expect there to be peace, because you haven't dealt with what's going on within me. And I think that's what needs to happen. And healing, oh man.
And I'm sure there's been a tendency of saying Africa should forget
and move on.
And move on. But
And there's a lot of that thinking.
Yes, but today you talk about the Jews. I mean, the genocide that was carried out against the Jewish people. Yes. And Germany paid reparations to the Jews. That's why is it impossible for the Western countries to do the same to the African people?
To African countries, correct.
And because from the slavery genocide to cultural genocide, to colonization, to looting, to, I mean, the statements are more, but I'm sure there's a need for us to engage and to dialogue with each other for us to come to what they've been able to do to the Jewish people. And the Jewish people, some of them, they've also come to terms to what really happened to some of their family members who were actually executed during the genocide.
Yes. I would just want to add that even as part of this process of reparations, it's important for any person who has transgressed to just, I can't emphasize it, it's that validating to that person that what you are feeling, I understand it, or I may not understand it, but I acknowledge that what you are feeling is true. And in you acknowledging it, that gives me room to actually let it go. Because if you don't acknowledge it, then you don't think you've done anything wrong. And I also feel like, for example, if an object, for example, is returned, number one, on loan, then you still think you own it. And that's where the mistake is, because then clearly, and you've already, when you've come here, when you had that Berlin conference and you came here, you already did not think of the African person as someone who is human, because you came and you enslaved them. Number two, you didn't think of them as people that had dignity. I mean, you thought you've sacrificed your life for just fighting me. And these were the orders that this guy gave. So at the end of the day, if you still don't want to acknowledge that you've been wrong and you don't want to fix that and acknowledge that African people are truthfully human beings, number one, but that they are people of value, then that's where you miss it. Then it's still the same mindset. Then your mindset still hasn't changed. And only in these dialogues, that's where the mind gets transformed, because you've got to hear over and over. From me, you've got to hear. From you, you've got to hear. From my sister, you've got to hear that there has been an injustice, and that as much as you hear it, maybe it'll get to you somewhere that, okay, maybe I have actually done something wrong. Because as long as you think you haven't done it wrong, you're not going to behave accordingly.
And so this moment, this global pandemic, it's had a silver lining in a way, in that, well, Raphael, for you, you've described, and I'm quoting you here, that you've been working on your digital back office, that you've begun this process of having these conversations with different people around the world, and that these digital formats have provided a way of connecting and of telling some of these forgotten histories. Do you see the future of repatriation and restitution as being connected with this digital strategy that you've been taking?
I'm sure we have to move with times, because as a cultural institution, when the pandemic started, we were caught unaware. But we've actually come to realize that the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 has become, it's now a fertile ground for creativity. And I can see that the repatriation and restitution issue of African objects, there's a way for us to be able to repatriate some of these collections through the digital media. And the rush the digital rush that has been happening across the world has created an opportunity for us as a gallery. And as we are talking now, our Harare Conversations, which is Harare Conversation, Bulawayo Conversation, Mutare Conversations, which are on YouTube, is now another channel that we can reach out to a number of audience that we could not get walking through the National Gallery door. So it is important for us to take advantage of this new technology for us to be able to valorize our collection so that the audience, the digital audience, we can cash in on the digital audience. As cultural institutions, and I'm sure this is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity. It's a time to rebirth for most of the cultural institutions in the continent, so that at least we can move on into this new world.
Well, I want to just thank you both so much for today, and I want to thank everyone who's listened in. It's been an extraordinary experience, and I hope that this will be the first of many dialogues that we will have together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, James.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much for your team for organizing this, because I'm sure it is a very, very critical discussion that we need to continue, so that at least we can be able to come to terms with each other and be able to do the right thing in terms of repatriation and restitution.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks.
Thank you.